Well, it's tax time. April 15th is right around the corner. Do you feel like you paid too much tax for 2024? If so, stay tuned to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome to Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host Sarah Samuels, and today we're talking about how to save taxes. No, not for 2024, because that's in the rearview mirror, but how to start planning now to save in 2025 and beyond.
Dave, it's great to be here with you and, of course, with all of our listeners. And, it's unfortunately bad news for people who are thinking, hey, maybe I can get some last minute tips to squeeze in here to try to make the most of my taxes for 2024. But better yet, the show will be about planning ahead and doing better and make 2025 to make sure that you're not paying too much in taxes. But there are still some people, right, that maybe are still wrapping up their 2024 taxes.
Well, if you're thinking about like an IRA contribution, something they can do, yeah, they can certainly do that. This year, you could put in $7,000 into a traditional IRA, and if you're 50 and over, you could put in an extra $1,000. That's $8,000 to catch up, but only for certain people. See, as a general rule, Sarah, you have to not be part of a pension plan, which means you're not part of a 401k or a 403b or anything like that.
Okay.
So for some people, it can work. Now, for most, it can't. Now, what if you're self-employed? Well, if you're self-employed, you could set up a SEP, an SEP plan, and that allows you to it's kind of like an IRA on steroids for self-employed people, right? So if you're self-employed or you have some self-employment income, a 1099 income, well, then yes, then you could do an SEP plan also. So those are the two biggest things that you could do now for 2024, since we're so far into 2025. But really, a lot of things you could do for this year that I'm excited to talk about today, Sarah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to offer this exclusive offer to all of our listeners. We want to invite you to call into our Ask Dave hotline. That phone number is 800-822-1111 and leave us your name, number, and your brief voicemail with a question for the show. And if we use your question on a future show, we'll make sure that you get a free copy of Dave's book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. Our question here comes from Connie in Connecticut. Connie says, my husband and I used to be able to itemize deductions for taxes, but now we don't do it anymore. But really, we'd like to be able to do it again. What can we do?
All right, Connie. Well, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's because of the changes that occurred almost 8 years ago now under the first Trump administration. The good news is that you're probably paying a lower percentage tax overall than you were before that tax change, again, 7 or 8 years ago now. Although it may not feel like it because you can't itemize. Because here's what happened, Connie. They raised the level of the standard deduction and capped certain deductions. So before, the standard deduction was a small number. Now you're married, you can have a standard deduction this year of as much as $30,000. So you only itemize if your deductions are greater than $30,000. Now, here's the rub. Before, if you lived in a high tax state where maybe you paid a lot of, real estate was expensive, you paid a lot of property tax, you paid a lot of state income tax, you could deduct all of that. Well, today, you can't. You can only deduct $10,000 as an itemized deduction. So because that SALT limit, you are now limited, and now you have to get another $20,000 of other deductions added on to the 10 to get over $30,000. So now you can actually itemize. So now let's say you have a $500,000 mortgage that you've had for a few years, and it's at a 4% interest rate. Well, that 4% of a $500,000 is $20,000. You still can't justify itemization. So you're limited at $10,000 of tax deduction between your state income tax, the state of Connecticut, which, as we all know, can be as high as 7%, between the property tax, again, all capped at 10. But even with a $500,000 mortgage, you can't really itemize unless you have charitable deductions. So can you go and get into more debt potentially and buy a bigger home or take out, more mortgage loans? Sure, possibly. But even now, the limit on a new home is $750,000. That's it. Now, at today's interest rates at 7%, well, gosh, 7% of a $750,000 mortgage, that's $50,000. Yeah, I can go buy in a bigger house, take a bigger mortgage, and I can itemize. But if you're listening to the show, it's probably because you're retired or close to retirement, and you've got to think about whether or not that makes financial sense just to save some taxes. Or you can give a lot of money to charities. But that only makes sense if you have charitable intent. Okay? Remember, you get the deduction, but that's because you've given the money away. And my suspicion is if you are highly charitable, you're probably maxing out what you feel comfortable giving already anyway. So not much news there, unfortunately, but Connie, stay tuned the rest of our show because we're going to talk about other things that you might be able to do to save some taxes.
Connie, thank you so much for calling the Ask Dave hotline. Again, that phone number is 800-822-1111. Call us and leave us a voicemail with your name and number and your question for the show. And if we use your question on the show, we'll make sure you get a copy of Dave's Amazon bestseller, The Retirement Income Source, the ultimate guide to eternal income. And thank you for tuning in this weekend to The Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and with tax time right around the corner, you may be thinking to yourself, hey, how can I save more and not pay so much in taxes, at least for next year? Because there's really not too much you can do for the 2024 season. And Dave, you just answered a really interesting question from Connie, who was talking about the standard deductions versus itemized deductions. And you made a good point, which is don't really sacrifice income to avoid paying taxes. And I think that's a good message for our listeners to hear.
Yeah. Having $750,000 of mortgage debt at today's rates of 7% or so, 6.75%, just to get more deductions doesn't make a lot of sense because you still have to pay that interest.
Right.
Yeah, the government's helping you vis-a-vis the tax deduction, but still, you have to pay it. So if, you're buying a bigger home, okay, maybe it might make sense if you want to buy a bigger home or a more expensive home or something different. But don't let the tax tail wag the dog.
Yeah. So if you're still working, Dave, what are some things that you could potentially do now to maybe save on taxes later on?
Well, the biggest thing that you want to do if you have a qualified plan, a 401k plan, so you can't get a tax deductible IRA like we talked about at the top of the show, then max out your 401k. You could put $23,500 into a 401k. If you're 50 and over with catch-up features, you can put up to $31,000 in a 401k. So if you're married, that's $62,000. Now, you might say, well, we can't afford to put that much away. Well, maybe, but what if you have some money sitting in the bank? Who's to say that you can't put more into the 401k by withholding it from your paycheck than you can afford to do, and then just spend down some of your savings to help support your lifestyle? Because if you put $31,000 into a 401k, that's right off the top of your income. It might save you $8,000 to $10,000 or $12,000 worth of taxes. So yeah, I can't afford to save $31,000, but because I did it, now maybe I spend down a little bit of my bank account or a little bit of my brokerage account. So sometimes you have to think a little bit outside the box to take advantage of these tax benefits. But that's a great ability to just have a lot of income not taxed.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a great plan for all of our listeners that are still working. But what if you're retired and you can't contribute to your 401k anymore? We'll talk about what you actually can do to save some money on taxes. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to The Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about taxes, especially with tax time right around the corner. Now, so far we've talked a little bit about if you have not retired yet, one of the best things to do, and that's really contributing to your 401k, especially if you're over age 50, you can make those catch-up contributions. That's one way to help reduce your tax bill. But Dave, a lot of our listeners, they might already be retired. So can we really break it down what people should do maybe for those that are retiring early versus those retiring later?
Sure. And I think with the earlier ones, it's much like what we spoke about a moment ago, right? Even if you can't afford to max out your 401k when you're working, you put that $31,000 in, maybe you can only afford to do half that. Well, that's okay, because if you have non-IRA, non-401k accounts, maybe you spend $15,000 down out of one of those accounts so that you could put more money into the pre-tax plan and save taxes. So same is true, or I should say similar to when you're retired. In early retirement, a lot of tax planning comes down to how you spend your various accounts, your various buckets of money. And you're going to have your taxable bucket, which is all your IRA, 401k stuff that's been tax deferred, and now when it comes out, it's taxable. So let's call that tax deferred bucket. Then you have your tax-free bucket, like your Roth IRAs and everything, and then you have your regular taxable accounts. Well, if you simply spend down your taxable accounts first and don't dip into your IRAs and 401ks yet, those tax-deferred buckets, you'll pay less tax earlier on. But there's a couple things you need to be careful of. First of all, realize that at age 73, you have to start taking distributions from those IRAs and 401ks. So this plan only works for so long. And also, it works better if you don't take Social Security right away. If you defer Social Security to age 70, then you have your 60s, if you've retired that early, to live off that taxable account, which most of those withdrawals from that account are tax-free, and let the IRAs and 401ks, those tax-deferred accounts, just grow. And by the way, if you do defer Social Security to age 70, it means you're going to end up getting a much bigger benefit anyway. So it's a strategy you might want to consider, even taxes aside.
And I want to invite all of our listeners to call in and call our Ask Dave hotline. Again, that phone number is 800-822-1111. Call in and leave us a voicemail with your name and number and your question for the show. And if we use it, we'll make sure you get a free copy of Dave's Amazon bestseller, The Retirement Income Source, the ultimate guide to eternal income. And thank you to Jeff in Connecticut for calling in. Jeff says, I'm retired and I heard about this Irma tax. I do not want to get caught by surprise with a tax. So what do I need to know?
All right, Jeff, the dreaded Irma tax. All right, well, first of all, Irma is not really a tax, even though it's referred to that way, Jeff. It's really where your income's over a certain level, $106,000 per year if you're single, $212,000 if you're married, at which the cost of your Medicare Part B and the cost of your prescription coverage goes up. But it phases in. So it phases in if you're single up to $500,000 of income. So the phase-in period is from 106 of income to 500. And if you're married, the phase-in period is 212 to 750. And again, it just causes your Medicare Part B and your prescription coverage to cost more. But what if you max it out? What if you get up to that $500,000 as a single taxpayer? Well, then the extra cost would be an extra $500. So, yeah, let's put it in perspective, Jeff. If you are going to be at 115 of income and you can engineer it down to 106 and not pay anything, great. You might save yourself $100, not 500, just 100, because you're in that phase-in period. But let me ask you, if you're making $500,000, do you really care about paying an extra $500 a month for Medicare Part B? And for most people, they'd say no. Or if you're married, it'd be an extra $1,000 a month between you and your spouse. But again, if you're making $750 per year, $750,000, do you really care about an extra $1,000 a month? Probably not. But again, if you're going to be at 220 of income as a married couple, and you can get down below the 212 and save yourself maybe 100, 150 a month during that phase-in period, then maybe it makes sense. So again, you have to look at where you are. Are you close enough that you can actually get down below it? And if you can't, my best advice, don't worry about it. Because at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. If you're making the income, you're always going to have more left over to enjoy it anyway. So don't stress over it, but those are the rules. I hope that helps, Jeff.
Yep. Jeff, thank you so much for calling in. We'll make sure you get your free copy of Dave's book. Please call in. We're inviting all of our listeners to dial that number. It's 800-822-1111 and leave us your name and number along with your question for the show. And if we use your question, we'll make sure you get a copy of Dave's book, The Retirement Income Source, the ultimate guide to eternal income. And we appreciate you tuning in and listening to The Retirement Income Source, where it's always all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today we're talking about ways that you can always keep more of your income through paying less taxes, potentially being more efficient with the way that you pay taxes. And Dave, it's interesting because we get these call-ins from listeners like Jeff, who is worried about this Irma tax. And I think people really get caught up in the weeds sometimes because they're so worried about maybe getting caught by surprise when it comes to tax time. There's a lot of mystery surrounding it for a lot of people.
Well, it's just like somebody saying, yes, I want to max out my mortgage, take a $750,000 mortgage on a house that I don't need at 7% interest just so I can itemize, right? You don't want to do that. because now the tax tail wags the dog. And the same thing could be true with Irma. I mean, like I said, if you're going from 212 of income as a married couple to 750, that's an extra over $500,000 of income. So if you pay 12,000 of that in extra Medicare Part B coverage, it's not that big of a deal.
Right, because you're making too much more in income.
That's right. And I hear people sometimes saying, hey, you always talk about investing for income, Dave. I don't want more income. It means I have to pay more tax. Well, but remember, the tax rate is never 100%. Even if you're in the highest rate, the 37% bracket, which you've got to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars to get there, it means you still get to keep 63 cents on a dollar, right? You're never paying 100 cents on a dollar in tax.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about deferring taxes too through different ways, including annuities.
Annuities. So let's talk about the older retirees then. When they get to the point where you've taken Social Security, or maybe you're taking required minimum distributions, a couple things you could do.
Yeah.
Some people will take their taxable accounts, their non-IRA, non-401k accounts, put them in annuities to get some tax-deferred growth, or at least take the required minimum distributions and put it into an annuity so that they don't compound their tax problem, right?
Yep.
It's one strategy. Other people use municipal bonds. You know, municipal bonds are tax-free, at least federally tax-free, and if you buy municipal bonds from the state in which you live, then it's tax-free federally, and it's also tax-free from a standpoint of state income tax. So if you're a conservative investor and you want to invest for income, municipal bonds could work, annuities can work, one or the other. Or if you're a more aggressive investor, let's say your IRAs and 401ks are conservative, Sarah, most of your money's conservative, and now you're forced to take these required minimum distributions. Well, guess what? The RMDs are only 4%, right? So if you have $1 million, your RMD is going to be $40,000. So how else can you get tax deferral? Well, if you want to get more aggressive, right? We talked about you want to get more conservative with tax-free bonds and annuities. What if all your other stuff's conservative and I want to take a little risk here. This is going to be for legacy. Well, now you can go ahead and buy some growth stocks or some growth ETFs, in which case with those, you don't pay taxes really until you sell them. And if they grow tax deferred for the next 20 years of your life and you pass them on to your heirs, then you get a step up in basis. You get a tax forgiveness at death. So there are strategies that you can utilize later on in life to help save taxes.
Yeah, but sometimes deferring those taxes, those early in retirement taxes, for later in retirement can cause some problems of their own. They might not be the solution either. I'm Sarah Samuels. I'm here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Thank you for spending some time here with us today on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we've been talking all about taxes, including if it's better to do them early or later. And we were talking about some people choose a strategy where they might want to defer those taxes in early retirement. Maybe they use some of those more conservative options, municipal bonds and annuities. Dave, you mentioned if you have mostly conservative investments, maybe you want to take a little risk here and maybe invest in some growth stocks as a way to defer those taxes for later. But sometimes this can cause a ticking time bomb down the road.
Yeah, and what you're referring to primarily is if you have too much money in that tax-deferred bucket. So remember, there's three buckets. There's your tax-deferred bucket, your IRAs and 401ks. And because you haven't paid any taxes on that money up until now, every dime that gets withdrawn down the road is taxable. Then you have your tax-free bucket. These are like Roth IRAs. This is life insurance. This is 529 plans if you have those for children or grandchildren, right? And then you have your regular taxable accounts, your savings accounts, your bank CDs, maybe your brokerage accounts. So the concern is if you're lopsided in these tax-deferred accounts. You've done such a great job, saving everything into 401ks and IRAs. Then you retire, you've got $1 million, and it's great you haven't paid any taxes, but now every dime that comes out is taxable. Now, that's not bad for income, Sarah. You're paying taxes on the income, and you might even be in a lower bracket than when you work, depending upon how much you've saved. But the problem is now, let's say you want to buy a car, right? And your car costs $40,000. Well, you might have to withdraw $60,000, give $20,000 to the IRS, so you have $40,000 left over to buy your car. So now you have nothing left for lump sum purchase or major expenses that actually have to come out of there. So now you get stuck trying to figure out, okay, how do I buy a car? Or, how do I pay to replace my roof or something like that?
Right. It's almost like withdrawing it. You pay more because of the taxes versus relying on the income. You don't have to
That's
worry
right.
about that.
Those accounts are made for income, not lump sum purchases. And that's where the tax time bomb can be created.
Yeah. Well, Dave, I think you can help our next Ask Dave question. And I want to invite all of our listeners again to call in, leave us a voicemail. That number is 800-822-1111. And if you call us and leave a voicemail, you may be able to receive a free copy of Dave's book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. So our question from Paul in Connecticut. Paul says, we're in the last couple of years before retirement, and we're trying to load up our 401ks. Is that really the best strategy?
All right, Paul. Well, the answer is it depends. Because if you have balance between those three accounts I just discussed, if you have some money in taxable accounts, some money in tax-free accounts, some money in tax deferred, and you're in a high tax bracket right now, maybe that's the best strategy. Why? Because if you're in a high enough tax bracket and you want to max that out and put $31,000 a year in, it may only decrease your take-home pay by $18,000 or $20,000. So think about it. You're decreasing your take-home pay by $18,000 or $20,000, but you've got $31,000 going into the plan going to work for you. That's some pretty good leverage. However, what if you're lopsided toward that plan? If you're like most, you've maxed it out, you've done everything. Maybe your kids are out of college, so you don't have any 529 money. Maybe you got a little bit in a Roth IRA, but that's about it. Now, you might have the problem I just described, Paul, where you're retired, you go to buy a car, and guess what happens? You have to pull out a lot more than the cost of the car to pay the IRS to have enough money left to buy that car. But it's not just cars. It's if your furnace goes, you have to replace that. It's if your roof goes, major repairs, anything. So in your case, you may not want to max that out. You might decide that doing the catch up on Roth IRAs might make sense. You could do $8,000 a year. So if you're married, Paul, you and your wife could do $16,000 a year in Roth IRAs, assuming you're within the income limits, and build tax-free money. So if you have 5 years left, that's 16 times 5, that's $80,000 that goes in with some growth. That gives you some tax-free money where now you can take some money out of that account if you need to for a lump sum purchase. So you have to diversify according to taxes, right? Just like Paul, your financial advisor, probably says diversify according to investments. We have to diversify according to taxes too, between the tax deferred, the taxable, and the tax-free. Paul, I hope that helps.
Paul, thank you so much for calling into that Ask Dave hotline. And we want to invite all of our listeners to call in. Again, that phone number is 800-822-1111. And if we use your question on a future show, we'll make sure you get a free copy of Dave's book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. And we appreciate you spending some time here with us, of course, on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And we're talking about taxes and ways that you can be most efficient and not pay too much in taxes and avoid the tax time bomb. So, Dave, you just answered a question from Paul, and you were warning him that there is a problem with having too much money in that tax deferred bucket you mentioned, because you end up really paying way too much in taxes if you need to take some of that money out to make a purchase like a car or a furnace or a roof. So what can people do to make sure they don't end up with too much money in that bucket?
Well, in Paul's case, he's got a few more years left, so he can slow down his savings into the tax deferred bucket and put more money, maybe just do, and I should have said this to him, but maybe do just to get enough to get the match from his employer, and then take the rest and put some of the rest into Roth IRAs or into a regular taxable brokerage account. So he's starting to build up. He's no longer building up one, he's building up the others. But the real trouble, Sarah, comes in, when people are retired. They can't do that anymore. They can't just change where they're funneling their new dollars, their new savings, because they've already saved. And if they retire and they're lopsided, now they've got to start considering, gosh, does a Roth conversion make sense for me? Should I convert a traditional IRA, traditional 401k to a Roth?
And who does that make the most sense for, Dave?
Well, it makes the most sense, I think, again, for people in early retirement, if they catch it, right? If they're not taking the required minimum distributions, especially if they're deferring their Social Security to age 70, now those people can oftentimes start to make that conversion. They can make the conversion from the IRA to the non-IRA. And what it does, it makes the tax problem less severe when they turn 73 and they do have to take those forced required minimum distributions from IRAs.
Right. And that's when you have to draw down those tax deferred accounts because, of course, Uncle Sam needs his cut. He needs to get paid, right?
Right? God forbid you live to be 100 and they have to wait that long.
They
That's
can't
right.
wait till 100, right? 73.
But that's a good, that's a great way to balance in those early retirement years. But Sarah, I've seen some people even in later retirement years who are concerned about tax brackets going up, and they've got longevity in their family, and they want to maximize what their family can get. So they're taking out the RMDs, but they're saying, well, what else can I do? And maybe they don't even need the required minimum distributions. What some of those people do is take out more than the required minimum distribution, take the extra, convert it to a Roth IRA, and because they don't need the required minimum distribution, use some of that to pay the taxes on the Roth IRA conversion. So now they're paying more tax today, but they're doing it in a controlled way. But I always say don't try this at home.
Yeah.
The most important thing when you're doing Roth conversion analyses is to figure out where your tax brackets are, how close you are to the next bracket, and to have a strategy. You're not going to convert a whole IRA in 1 year. It's usually a strategy over 5 or 10 years that's well planned out and thought out in advance.
And we appreciate you, of course, joining us today and listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And most important, we hope that you're here with us also next week, same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you've been listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.